So the title of my presentation is Grave Matters, Dispossession and the Desecration of Ancestral Graves by Mining Corporations. And just to give you a sense of the area that I work in. So here we look at coal mining affected communities. So that is the four-cornered box is representative of where coal is mined in South Africa. And so over there, that is the Mpumalanga province. That's where the coal mining is actually concentrated, as well as coal burning. And over there at the top as well, that is the northern, that is the Limpopo province. In the northern parts of the Limpopo province, so that's towards Lephalale, the Waterberg area, that's where coal is mined. And as well as parts of the KwaZulu-Natal province. So there's also other parts, but mainly in South Africa, in the three provinces, that's where coal mining actually takes place. Now, as I said, we will be talking about dispossession, but I wanted to ask you, just to break the ice, like what comes to mind when you think of dispossession or when you hear the word dispossession? Anything, please be comfortable. Anything that comes to mind, dispossession, what do you think of? Yeah, Busis.
Having something taken away from something that you own.
Yes, yeah, no, absolutely. It is definitely about something being taken away, usually forcefully, right? So I think what's important for me to share is that dispossession in South Africa, but also in Africa and globally. In South Africa, we think about dispossession in relation to apartheid and the colonial period, right? So we think about it in historical terms, usually. And historians always think about dispossession in relation to the land. And so I'm trying to think about dispossession much more differently from our previous historians, because they thought about dispossession simply as the loss of land violently. But I'm trying to say there's other things which are lost when the land is taken away. So it's not just the loss of the material thing, but much more. And I think that's what I'm going to try and show throughout my presentation. And what I'm talking about is actually post-apartheid mining-induced dispossession. Now, you wouldn't think that dispossession would take place in the post-apartheid era, right? Because you associate it with the colonial and apartheid period. So I'm going to try and convince you that there is actually dispossession that's taking place with our current political dispensation, so with our current government. So in the area where I work, most of you will be familiar with a company called Glencore. It's a Swiss-based company, and in Mpumalanga, it's been mining coal. And the area that I specifically looked at is Ochis, which is southwest of Witbank in Emalahleni. And this is Tweefontein, and there were other farms around, probably 5 or so, which were private-owned farms, white agricultural farmland, which was bought by Glencore. And so just to give you a sense of who lived on the farms, it's former labor tenants, and so they sold their labor, of course, in exchange for the land. They would have been forcefully removed from elsewhere, and that's how they ended up in this area in Tweefontein. And so extractor, before actually, just to give you a bit of sort of a brief history. So Glencore bought the farm from Extrata. So basically Glencore took over Extrata. So that's the optimization project. So then it became Glencore instead of Extrata. So when you see the word Extrata, don't get confused. And so then they started negotiations with the families from 2015, and going over towards 2017. Now, it's important to mention that part of the reason there has been relocations in the area is because mining has shifted from underground to open cast mining. And one of the reasons there's been this kind of shift is because open cast mining is more profitable, it's faster, but it destroys the land much more than underground mining. But it also requires quite a large amount of space. But also you will notice, I don't know if you know, the gold mines, for instance, that you can still live around the mine with underground mining, but open cast mining actually compels people to relocate, as well as their ancestral graves, as you will see. And so in the area in Tweefontein Farm, there were 120 families who were relocated, and over 1,000 graves that were relocated. And I had an opportunity to sit down with the families which were relocated and speak to them, and they shared some of their stories. And just to take you through what they have said, this is Ntate Tanka, and he said, Glencore organized trucks and trailers to transport our belongings. The mine covered the cost, but they did not give us an exact date. So when we saw our neighbors pack their belongings in the trucks, we packed too, because we knew that the mine was coming for us. You would know when the truck was at the gate that you are relocating. On the day of the relocations, we were loaded into trucks and left our vegetable gardens and other things. So that's how they were relocated. And for those of you who have done history at school, and some of you might be historians already, I mean, this actually, speaks to, for instance, what Desmond Cosmas writes about in The Discarded People. It's the same. And Ubabu Samson said, I did not want to leave, so they packed my things as I sat and watched them. They never issued a date, they simply showed up on the day. Inside the truck, they combined my things with my neighbors. It was not one truck per family. My livestock was left on the farm. It was fetched by the mine only after. I had 16 cows and 21 sheep. I lost it all. I lost my livestock to theft, starvation, and illness. I lost my being. Ngiluze ibhang lam, meaning I lost my bank. And Ubabutanka as well said, angrily actually, the mindset will compensate me, us, that they will pay for my cattle. Ziphi namhlanje izinkomo zami, ziphi izimvu zami, anginalutho. So he's saying, where's my cattle today? And I don't have anything, right? So he's lost it all. Now this isn't that the Tanka on a day in which they took me to where they used to live. It's now barricaded, so it's all fenced around. And it was interesting because he could recollect, so he has a memory of where the house used to be, where home used to be. But for me, coming in as a researcher from outside, I couldn't quite get a sense of that, because all I see is coal mining dumps and so on. And so, but it was interesting to see that he still has, that memory to say, lapha kwakuhlala bobani, lapha kwakuhlala bakuphi kunestolo, there was a shop, sasithengisa kwakuphi, those kinds of things. And so it was very interesting. And this is, I think, this sort of gives you a sense of where they used to live and how they lived on the farm. So, this is how they had built, and they were able to to grow their food. So that house where I showed you, there are 5 families which have resisted, and so they've said they're not relocating. And they've been able to stay, of course, with the help of legal action and so on. And so when I visited the families, they were able to give me spinach, netanga. But also this shows you, the kind of life that they had on the farm. So they could eat from the land and feed themselves. Here, they had chickens, and so when they speak about the farmland, it's like there was no starvation, so people were never hungry at all. Now they were moved from the farmland and taken to this area, which it's a township actually. It's in Paula, but the houses are very much RDP look-alike, and the soil is different, slightly more acidic and not as fertile, but also the space is very small. I mean, if you know the spaces around RDP areas, this is very small, you cannot do much on it. And if you think about it, in a township, it's a much more monetarized economy in a way. And I'm saying that because if you don't have money in a township, you will sleep hungry. Or you have to go next door, whereas Emaplazini, it was different on farmland because, as I said, they worked the land and ate from it, and so that helped. So I'd like to fast forward a little and take you to another area that I cover, which is Gwasomkele, right? Gwasomkele is in KwaZulu-Natal, north of Richards Bay. Now, Isomkele is being mined by Itendele, and it's been mined by Itendele since 2007. Itendele mine is a subsidiary of, I think it's Petmin, and Petmin is based in Canada. They also mine anthracite coal, which is very lucrative, so it generates more profit actually than the coal that's being mined in Tweefontein. And so it's been working in this area, which has over 20 villages. But obviously the setting here is different because this is tribal land. So it's different from white agricultural farmland. So it's also important for me to mention that on tribal land, when mining companies come in, they negotiate with the chief. Now, this is different from white agricultural farmland, where you buy the land from the farm owner, or the farm owner sells the land to the state, which then leases the land perhaps to the mining company. Now, in this case, it's different because the land is believed to belong to Ingonyama. And so then the mining companies go straight to the chief and negotiate with him. But Ubabu Makubani, when I spoke to him about the early days of mining in the area, this is what he had to say. They called us. At the time we had Uchief Mkwanazi, we were told that the mine is coming. We were promised jobs. They said that no one will be poor. They said if you have a tractor and a van, you could use these in the mine to generate an income. So we agreed, seeing that the chief had already agreed. The mine's approach was to tell us about upcoming mining plans. We were not asked about whether we wanted the mine. We were told by the chief. The mine never kept any of its promises. I had a tractor and a truck which I had to sell. So I think that's what it's saying at the bottom. So here, as I said, they speak to the chief and seek consent from him. And so they don't necessarily consult with villagers. And that is one of the problems that we see, not just in KZN, we've seen it with the case of Xolobeni, also other cases as well in the Northwest Province where there's platinum mining. And also, they promise jobs. So that's the language they use to dispossess. They know that people are actually hungry for jobs. And so they say, abantu bazosebenza. So no one will be hungry. Everyone will get to work in the mine. And before you know it, the families realize that actually none of our people work in the mines, right? So that's how dispossession takes place, through the language of jobs. Ubabum Kwanazi, their family was relocated in 2008, and this is what he had to say. At first, they said we were not going to be relocated. To my surprise, later on, I saw boys erecting a mine fence inside my yard. When I said, but I thought the mine will not affect me, they said, this is an instruction from the mine. The mine's boys then said the next time they came, sorry ma, we need to remove you and the house. They had a tractor. Ngakhala sisi, ngakhala ngaze ngathula, bayidiliza, and so they destroyed the house. And so the first part of the presentation was obviously to give you a sense of who the families are and the fact that, you know, they get subjected to relocations and they lose their land, but also they lose their ancestral graves, actually, which is, I think, the matter that we're gathered here to discuss tonight. So in Tweefontein, the labor tenant families used to be given a little portion to bury their loved ones. So what you see there are some of the graves that used to be on the farm. Interesting enough, when I went for my field work, I was working Babumgina, and the mine had actually fenced the graves. So I actually, on my thesis, I write I name or call this the barricaded ancestors, because they are fenced, and when you go into the mine, you are dressed as if you're going to an actual mine. So you have, you know, a whole helmet, and you're kitted as if you're going to a mine, when you're actually just going to the graves. And here's a side notification, which I found very interesting when I got to the gravesite. It's notifying the families that their graves will be exhumed. So it says notification of proposed exhumation and reinterment of graves at Tweefontein Colliery. But basically, here they've put a side notification, which for me I found problematic, because none of these families can actually access or see this side notification. So then that means families can literally come and find that their graves have been relocated. They also use Ikwekwezi FM, for those who are familiar with Mpumalanga, but this is a local radio station, right? But with South Africa's history of dispossession, people having moved, you know, at different times or time periods, you cannot use Ikwekwezi FM, because people would have gone back. You know, some were migrant laborers who had come to work in the coal mines. So when you announce on Ikwekwezi FM, you're not reaching all the families, and I found that really to be a problem. And so they hired a company, it's a heritage management company, to relocate or to facilitate the relocation processes. And so the company is called Professional Grave Solutions. And I thought it's very interesting, and I said it's commercializing the secret, because they're making money out of it. Most of the heritage management companies are administered by archaeologists, so they are actually making money or making a profit out of us. So it is a business. And I had an opportunity to actually sit with a director of Professional Grave Solutions. And interestingly, this is what he had to say. And he said, so there's competition, especially in the past few years. There are a whole lot of small archaeological companies that have sprung up. When it comes to grave relocations, I'd certainly say that we are the biggest company in the country doing that. You know, and so what is interesting is that heritage management companies, they submit it's a tendering system. So you submit your business model, etc., etc. And so there could be 3 sending to, let's say, Tendele or Tlenko, and then Tlenko will choose who's best, right? And it's not just heritage management companies, it's also funeral parlors as well, because obviously the graves have to be relocated and so on. And so they also submit through the whole tendering system. And Umama Lanu Mam Evelyn Nyati, this was in Tweefontein. When I spoke to her, she was the representative, Ya Bagwanyati. This is what she had to say. I found clothes on my remains. Sibongile, my daughter, was wearing a little dress and a little jersey with flowers. God did well because there were contestations over that grave. Anna had been saying it's their grave, her sibling's grave. So when we got there, we found Sibongile's clothes, which she wore when she drowned. So sometimes there are contestations over ownership of the grave or the remains and so on, particularly because people never really used to mark their graves as we do now. So having found the clothes helped in resolving, that conflict or contestation between families. And Ubabu Abel Mutweni, when I spoke to him, he said, we didn't find bones, we only found the soil. The remains had turned into darker soil, much darker than the soil surrounding these. So the undertakers placed that soil in black plastic bags. So the remains, after a long time, so first they decompose, and then after a long time, they change color basically, they fossilize. And so they start looking more like the soil, but of course they'll be of a different color. And so Ubabu Mtweni is explaining that they took those and then they put them in black plastic bags. And Ubabu Matibela really had a problem with this, and he said to me very angrily, he said, well, I said to them, this is not acceptable. A black plastic bag is for rubbish. It is the same when I go to a shop and you use a black plastic for me, I don't accept it. I did not accept the bags. These people are too important to me to be placed in a dustbin bag. Something you throw away, never. These people must be respected. And Ubabu Mguni said, a very old man, probably in his 80s at the time I interviewed him, I think it was in 2019, he said, my father and brothers, who were all buried in Tweefontein, were exhumed by the mine and reburied in Pola. When everything was done, they gave me 4,500 for their graves. So the mining company used to give 1,500 per grave, but this is not legislated, and so that's one of the problems, in that it's left, at the discretion of the companies to actually decide how much they pay people. So these are some of the graves. You see, Lana Abagwa Mahlangu. So this is the Mahlangu family. They were relocated and put here. When there are no dates, it means on the farm, because as I said, people never really used to make sure that they mark these and so on. They buried not thinking that the graves will be relocated. And so they wouldn't sometimes put the dates and so on, even though they knew when the person had died. So the mine simply took these and placed them here. Let's see. And here, and again, I did speak about how the country has a deep-rooted history of dispossession. And so some people would have moved on the farms voluntarily, sometimes by circumstances and so on. So then they would leave the graves. And so the mine, because for them they need to get on with the mining, they still relocated these. And hence you see here, they didn't put the names of the people because they don't know who the people are, and they've just placed them like this. And so these are actually getting vandalized. But interestingly here, I think, or perhaps worth noting rather, is how Zenzele, though it's not too clear, this is the name of the funeral parlor. Yeah, it's a little disrespectful to have the name of a funeral parlor, but not the name of the actual person there. And that's why I speak about the commercialization of the sacred. Now, moving on to the area that I'm contrasting Tweefontein with, Kwasomkele. This is a typical house you find in rural areas in South Africa, be it Limpopo, in the Northwest province. This is in KZN, Yindlu kaGogo. So it's considered an ancestral house, considered very sacred. And it's a homestead. Usually in a homestead, there'll be probably many houses, maybe 5, 8 houses similar to this. And one of the reasons there'll be many is because they are polygamous. And so kuzoba nendlu of the first wife, the second wife, third wife, and so on. Indlu yabantwana, the children's house, and so on. Then kuzoba nisibaya, there'll be a cattle kraal, and there'll be the graves. And the graves and the cattle kraal are believed to actually protect Indlu or Umuzi. So I think what's very important to note is that they bury in the homestead, which is different from on the white agricultural farmland, where they were given a piece of land to bury, so which sort of, it's like an informal cemetery. But here they bury on the property. So here ngang no babalana, and he took me to some of their ancestral graves. And interestingly, as we were walking, he said, Lana, this specific tree, I don't know what tree it is, I'm terrible, but he said his father said when he dies, he wants to be buried under that specific tree. So that is his father's grave. And those are some of the graves also on the property. And I think it's important here to mention that when someone says, when I die, I want to be buried under the specific tree, it could be that other family members as well, perhaps used to sit under the tree, maybe it has memories and so on. And I think it highlights the connection that people have with the land. Right? And so you'll find that someone like him as well actually finds peace in sitting under this tree, or perhaps when he's missing that connection with his father, that's where he can go and actually find a bit of connection or closure. So I think it goes back to the point that I'm trying to make, that when you dispossess the land, you're not just taking the material thing, but you are taking that connection that people actually have with the land. And so those graves, which you see on the homestead, many of the people in KZN no longer have those. Their graves have been relocated and placed in public cemeteries now, similar to this, right? And I'm still working on the idea of what are the implications of removing amatuna, let's say wabagwa Skosana in a homestead, uwafage newagwaba mahlang, right? So I'm in English, I'm saying that I'm working in my own writing in the book and speaking to the families, trying to understand what are the psychological impacts, for instance, of relocating graves which were once in a homestead where they had buried generations in the homestead, and suddenly these are relocated and now put with other families. So it's not just a matter of we cannot find those because they are mixed with other people. It's a spiritual thing that's going on. So that's what I'm actually trying to explore as I write. Also, I think worth noting as well is that we talk about post-apartheid mining-induced dispossession, where mining companies come in, they relocate people, they place them in other areas, people get ill, right? So they lose their land-based livelihoods, and they see the mine that has taken their land-based livelihoods, that has taken their land, but they are relocated and placed right next to a mine dump, right? So you see how the dispossession is taking place when people are alive, but also how people continue to be dehumanized when they're dead. So it actually doesn't stop. So the mine is a constant sight, constant reminder of loss, right? They wake up, the first thing they see is a mine. And so I spoke to one of the environmental activists in the area, Usis Medical Nziba, and he said, Tina nje ayisekho lento yokuthi umuntu uya endlini yakhe yokugcina. Right? So that means we no longer have the concept that the grave is your final resting place. Yeah. And this has actually informed the title of my upcoming book, which is No Last Place to Rest. Because it means people have no place to stay, where they can call home, where they can belong, but they also have no last place to simply rest, you know. And they didn't have a last place to rest during colonial and apartheid South Africa, and they still don't have a last place to rest in the post-apartheid era. Okay, so this is Ubabu, sorry. Okay, so this is Ubabundlazi, and this is what he had to say. Babayemba ngamapiki, so they were using pickaxes, and he says, omunye wethu nje bamkhiphe asayimbethe ingubo yakhe. Basnike okapoko, hayi lezi ngubo esasibambathisa zona. So they provided prison-like blankets for our remains, not the blankets we used to put on the deceased. Noma abanye bangasekho, amathambo bese kumhlabathi, bawuthela kulo kapoko, lo mhlabathi. Yeah, sorry. I apologize. I actually go through this a lot in my writing, so I need to work on this because it's quite emotional, very traumatic. You could find yourself smoking something quite strong. Yeah, actually, I never used to drink or smoke, but I'm quite tempted lately because of the material that I'm writing. And Ubabuzwani said, uma kuzogujwa kwakunalo mshini we TLB. So there was a TLB machine when we were digging. Kwakukhona labantu ababethi magumbiwa bati nali bogisi. So there were these people whom, as you were digging, they'd say, here's the box. Basuse ngamafosholo, so they were using shovels. Abenza nje kwakungahlelekile, meaning it was not organized. You know, they were just like working haphazardly. And then he says, lelo bogisi enalingcwabe ngalo nithola lingasekho ngoba seligugile. So meaning that the box that you would have used initially during the burials, though many families don't use boxes, they used to just bury people straight. And so he's saying that you'll find that that box is already, it is decomposed. And so uti lento esuga ibe khona ingubo, so you'll find the blanket. And then uti akuhlelekile ngoba namje ngangikhomba ngithi bamba nalithambo ligcina lishona le. So he's saying that it wasn't coordinated. Even myself, I was saying, be careful, here's a bone, you know, it's moving in the opposite direction and so on. So ube ubona ikhanda ngapha nangu umshini we TLB. So you would see someone's skull. In this case, he's actually talking about his family members which were being exhumed. And so you're seeing the skull, but there's also the TLB machine on the side. So these are some of the graves that I'm talking about, which have been relocated from people's homesteads, and they've been placed here in a public cemetery. So there's about 3 public cemeteries. And what's interesting here, but also makes, I think, me very angry, is that these are not marked. And in cases where they've been marked, for instance, the markers have been lost because they had used like plastic markers, which got eroded by the rain and wind. And so these actually lie there simply, exactly as it is. You don't know whose grave it is. And it was quite a vast area. So I'd say there's actually probably close to 300 graves lying in at least 3 different cemeteries which are not marked. And the people are complaining that they cannot find their people, right? So they know that the people were taken to the specific graveyard, but they don't know exactly where in that specific graveyard. So as a researcher, it gets really depressing because people are looking for solutions. They're saying, so how can you help? Because we can't just give you this information and you write and you publish. How can you help? And this is another grave site. Again, it has probably over 100 graves unmarked. And this is how they are. No name, nothing. They used North Coast. And so one of my plans is to actually interview North Coast, try and find out whether they've kept a registry somewhere, and so on. And these are some of the graves. So here it's actually pits. Because the grave starts sinking in over time, especially if the foundation is not that strong. And so when it's raining, the water actually gets stuck there at the top, and you have cattle that comes in and starts drinking water. So there are contestations, obviously. I'm in the area of political science, and so you have to speak about what kinds of contestations are we talking about here. So we have conflicting legislation in South Africa. We have, on the one hand, the Heritage Act, which protects people's ancestral graves, but you also have the MPRDA, which is South Africa's mineral law, which leases land for mining purposes. So on the one hand, one is trying to protect. On the other hand, one is market-driven, trying to create jobs. It's much more neoliberal, and so on. You also have a PILRA, which is supposed to protect people's informal land rights. But you also have the chief who's saying, well, this is my land, right? The Ingonyama owns many hectares of land in KZN. So there are those contestations, and the laws are supposed to have a synergy and work well together, but they're not. And you also have inadequate provisions in the legislation. And just to give you a classic example, there's a problem relating to consultation, right? What constitutes adequate consultation? Mining companies think, well, I've spoken to the chief and I've spoken to the entire people in Somkele, whereas this is happening because the legislation doesn't specify, and so mining companies are actually using those gaps in the legislation to dispossess people. And obviously, one of the things that sparked the contestations was the logistics of the removals, the use of black plastic bags, people being put in small boxes, right, after the exhumation and relocation. And you must think, for African people, not just African people actually, I think globally, most families, for instance, choosing a box is a very sentimental thing. And so to have them relocated and now placed in small boxes, and to also think to koko umkhulu, right? It's an elderly person now being put in a small box. That is one of the areas of contestation. And what are people saying? People are complaining to say we need to be compensated for our graves, not just because we're trying to sell them, but also because there are rituals that have to take place. You have to speak to the people and say, siyansusa, akusinto ejwayelekile, so it's not a common thing, but we have to remove you because of these circumstances. So you have to brew alcohol, kuthengwe imbuzi, kuthengwe inkomo laba abahlabayo, because people have got different beliefs and so on. But now if you're giving them 1.5 and inkomo it's what, 8.5, also depending ukuthi inkomo enjani nokuthi inkomo ebhekana nobani, inkomo kamama, inkomo kababa, those things they matter quite a lot. And they're saying, as Usisi said, you have to compensate us adequately because graves are evidence of our belonging, of our connection to the land, of the fact that we're natives of this country, right? But I'm arguing with the fact that people have to claim belonging post 1994, the fact that they have to use graves as evidence is telling us something about citizenship in South Africa, about their status of citizenship. Are they really citizens of this country? If you have to use a grave to prove your belonging, that you exist, so what did 1994 give us? Perhaps it only gave people only the opportunity to vote. But if you don't have a piece of land to rest, to be buried when you die, then are you truly a citizen of South Africa? So the argument I'm making, obviously, in the book and in my work in general, is that you've got a market-driven MPRDA. So we've got a mineral law that is really concerned about making profits, and you've got a minister who's really about making profits, who's calling the mining economy, the sunrise economy, and so on, but not really interrogating, the losses of mining, because there are gains, but there's also the losses of mining. So, and as I've highlighted, there are legislative gaps which have to be addressed. One of which, we're talking Nosisi, and I didn't highlight here in Lepalale, and it's happening everywhere else in South Africa. People don't have access to the graves that they've left on privately owned farms. And there's no legislation regulating this. So that means we have to go back and develop this, particularly because this country has a strong history of dispossession. And I'm developing a concept here, which is material reductionism. And the reason I'm developing it is to explain how people get dispossessed. So I'm saying that mining companies, when they see the land, they see the grave, they see the house, Indluga Gogo, they see Isbaya, the kettle kraal, they see replaceable material things. And when they see Indluga Gogo, it's built in concrete. It's a thatched roof. So they're like, well, you can replace the structure and put it elsewhere. It means nothing, but they don't understand what kinds of rituals and, attachment that people have to that specific space. Indluga Gogo, in that kunomsamo there, makshadwa. When someone has applied for a job 10 times and they cannot get a job, you go at Linga Gogo, you're eager to say, I have been applying and I'm not getting anything. That's the belief that people have. When a child is born, they go to that specific place. Umntwana, again, when they're born, their umbilical cord is buried by the kettle kraal. Umakshadwa, when there's a wedding, siyobiga umakot omusha in the kettle kraal. And so, but for the mining company, the material reductionism is just looking through the eye, classing people and saying they're uneducated, that structure is dilapidated anyway, so we can give you 30,000 and you rebuild it elsewhere. But they don't understand that you cannot rebuild that. And courts are actually also asking, so how much should we compensate the families in this case? And we're saying it's difficult, but maybe speak to the families and ask them, instead of coming to us and saying, you're educated, speak on behalf of the people. The people have to speak for themselves because it's their land that's being dispossessed. And I'm also trying to develop the idea of spiritual insecurity and intangible loss, to say that mining companies do not see, but also this is what historians did not see when they're writing about land dispossession, that there's also intangible loss, the one that you can't quantify, the one that you can't see. So that's the loss that, that man is talking about when he's saying, Ubaba, my father said you should bury me under this tree. So even if that man is dispossessed and you give him another piece of land elsewhere, that specific tree and that specific space cannot be replaced. And this is important with the issue of land claims. The government thinking, well, we're giving them land elsewhere. It is remedy to some extent in that you're giving people citizenship rights, right? I mean, you're fulfilling citizenship rights to property, but it doesn't necessarily really take away what African people have experienced as a result of dispossession. And so I think what my work is showing is that there is the continuous dehumanization of African people, and that African people are dehumanized, baphila, noma bashonile. So it's continuous. And ultimately, that will be the conclusion in the book, is that there's lawful exclusion. And unlawful exclusion is that you've got laws which were meant to remedy and create justice in the post-apartheid era, but instead those laws, because there's gaps and these are being exploited by the mine, people are now being excluded within the ambits or the parameters of the law. So a consultation, for instance, is stated in the MPRDA, and the mining company will say, well, we consulted with the chief. And so it's a tick box exercise, but it wasn't meaningful consultation. People were told to yasuga, not bakhulumisane now, negotiate. So you are still being abused, but now you're being abused within the law. So that's basically the argument that I'm trying to make in the book. Thank you so much. I'll stop here. Yeah.